Okay, think back to a time that you have told a story about yourself, maybe to a friend, and you're describing some event that happened in your life. You're describing some incident that took place, maybe something you participated in. And as you recount all of the details, you obviously make choices about what to include and what not to include in the story. And one thing that you'll know that you particularly don't include very often is embarrassing details about yourself in that story. So if you're trying to persuade someone of something or describe how great you were at something else, you typically don't talk about things that you did that are embarrassing because it would take away from the other main point you're trying to make in the story. Particularly if you're trying to make yourself look good and then you tell about dumb things that you did along the way. It doesn't make you look good in that story. Now, that being said, if you hear someone recount a story and they do share things that are embarrassing about themselves as part of that story, and maybe that embarrassing detail is a part of the story, you begin to recognize pretty quickly that there is likely very much truth in that story because people don't typically divulge embarrassing details about themselves. So when someone includes details in a story or in a recounting of something that doesn't make them look good, you can usually take it to the bank that this is true that they're saying because there's really no other motive that would make someone want to share an embarrassing detail other than the fact that it actually did happen and is a necessary part of the story. So now, as it relates to the Gospels, this is something that scholars have called the criterion of embarrassment. So even skeptical scholars, New Testament scholars, and conservative New Testament scholars all recognize that when we see embarrassing details in the New Testament, and in particularly in the Gospels, we're quick to point out that this is a strong indicator that we're dealing with truth here. So even skeptical authors or skeptical scholars, will go to the New Testament, and when they see embarrassing details there, they will recognize them as, hey, okay, this is probably true, because otherwise no one would put this sort of thing in here. So now, as it relates to the Gospels, what we mean by embarrassing details is this. So number one, it would be embarrassing details about the apostles. So think about this. The gospel authors and the apostles are trying to convince an audience in the first century that Jesus is Lord, that the gospel message is true, that Christianity is true, that Jesus is the divine Son of God. They're trying to convince and compel people that Jesus is who he said he was. And so anything that they would put in their writings that would take away from the credibility of the apostles or maybe people's willingness to believe them, anything that would take away from that, or anything that would take away from the person of Jesus, that would make it harder to believe in him, that would make you question something that seemed a little questionable that Jesus said or did. Those sorts of things would be the types of details that if the gospel authors were purely trying to create something that they could gain as much of a following as possible, they would not include these sorts of embarrassing details about Jesus or about the apostles. But when we do turn to our Gospels, what we do find is they are full of embarrassing details. And these are strong indicators that we're dealing with truth. We're dealing with accurate accounts of people recounting what they saw or heard or believed to be true. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 7 examples of different embarrassing details, embarrassing stories, or embarrassing sayings in the Gospels that are sort of scattered throughout, that when we take it as a whole, we can see that the Gospels are full of these embarrassing details. And taken as a whole, this is another strong indicator that the Gospels are, in fact, reliable reportage of actual historical accounts. Okay, our first example of an embarrassing detail about Jesus is his baptism. So, several of our Gospels record John the Baptist's ministry and him going around specifically and preaching a message of repentance and calling people to be baptized. So baptism was something that had become popular, and it was something that was tied to purification and repentance of sin and this new way of life. Now, you expect people who are sinners, people who maybe have turned away from God and are turning towards Him, or people who want to consecrate themselves to God, or whatever the case may be, it seems normal and natural for those people to get baptized, right? Now, Jesus, on the other hand, professes to be God's Son. He professes to be sinless. And this is the message that the apostles preach about Jesus as well. But yet, all these things aside, Jesus still says that He needs to get baptized to fulfill all things. So Jesus is choosing to participate in a ritual and says that He needs to participate in this, something that is for sinners. And you see when Jesus goes to John the Baptist is like, whoa, I should not be baptizing you, right? It should be the other way around. You should be baptizing me. I'm not worthy to untie your sandals. But Jesus does this anyway. Now, think with me for a second that if you were the gospel authors and you were trying to share a message about this perfect one, this sinless, spotless one, this divine Son of God, it seems odd and really it kind of goes against the overall message of your story, at least on the surface of it, that this Jesus character would be baptized, would do something that sinners are supposed to do. But it's the inclusion of this detail that adds authenticity to the story and helps you see that, hey, because this detail is so embarrassing and awkward, it must be true. Otherwise, why in the world would they include it in this story? So the second embarrassing detail that we want to cover is regarding Jesus' family. So we don't get a lot of detail about Jesus' family. We see them here and there in the Gospels. We know a little bit about Mary and Joseph because of the birth narratives, but we don't get a lot about Jesus' brothers or sisters. But one fact that does surface in the Gospels is that Jesus' brothers did not believe in Him early on. It doesn't appear. And there's even one instance where they take Jesus and they're trying to get Him away to keep Him quiet, because they're like, hey, you're going a little too far with this thing, man. and you can see right away how this is embarrassing. This is not a detail. If you're trying to persuade people that, hey, Jesus, He is this God-man. He really is divine. He's the Son of God. He worked miracles, etc., etc. You don't include this detail about His family not believing in Him. Because if there is one group of people, one audience that knows Jesus better than anybody else, that should be able to vouch for His divine credentials, it would be His family, His siblings. But yet, it's the opposite that we find, that they seem to be detractors of Jesus, at least on some level, and not fully affirming of His claims early on. Now, we know from, like, for instance, James, that he does come to believe after the resurrection and changes his mind. But again, if you are the gospel authors and you were trying to convince an audience that this Jesus guy is who He said He was, He is God's Son, then putting in a detail about Jesus' family disowning Him is certainly an embarrassing detail and one that only makes sense if it's true, why it's there. It only makes sense for it to be there if in fact it's true. Otherwise, the gospel authors would certainly have no incentive to include it into the story. The third example of an embarrassing detail in the Gospels is related to John the Baptist, and specifically his doubt about the messiahship of Jesus while John is in prison. So we know the story that John the Baptist was in prison, that it was Herod who put him in prison, and he had called Herod out for having an affair with his brother's wife. And so John is locked up. He's despairing of his life, and some of his followers come to him, and he asked them to go and ask Jesus, hey, are you the one, the Messiah, or is there somebody else that I should be looking to? And so this is the same John who had baptized Jesus earlier in the Gospel of Matthew and had recognized Jesus for who He was. And now he's living in this moment of doubt, like, oh, is Jesus really that person? And again, I want you to think also about what Jesus says about John the Baptist, that there's been no one born of woman greater than John the Baptist. So in the Gospels, in the ministry of Jesus, the person who stands closest to Jesus in terms of prominence or holiness or righteousness is John the Baptist. Now, again, like with our other examples, we can see that this is very embarrassing for making the case for Jesus. So if people who were close with Jesus, who had recognized him as the Son of God, if those people then begin to question that claim, it makes you wonder, gosh, if John saw all these things and yet he's still doubting, how am I supposed to believe, right? It looks embarrassing on the surface. And one of the beautiful things about this story is it just shows the humanity of John. And that doubt is part of being human. And we have no reason to think John didn't have those doubts resolved, but because of his suffering and his circumstances, it really put some existential pressure on him during that particular time. But again, the only way to explain why the gospel authors would include this, because it doesn't help their cause in terms of making the case for Jesus' divinity, and that people should follow Jesus because of that. But it is embarrassing, and the thing that makes sense of why it's included is because it actually did happen. Okay, so our fourth example of an embarrassing detail in the gospel accounts is the response of the disciples of Jesus after the resurrection, and really even after the crucifixion. So again, let's think in our minds, the gospel authors are writing this story about Jesus to compel people to follow him, and also to follow the teaching of the apostles about the gospel and about Jesus. Now, if you let's look at the death of Jesus, look at that account first. The apostles are scared little children. None of them can be found at the crucifixion. They run away. They're scared. They're hiding, and they end up locking themselves in a room. Peter's denying Jesus to this young girl outside of where they've been keeping Jesus. And then even when we get to the resurrection itself and they hear about Jesus being raised from the dead, some of them believed, but others of them doubted. And even Thomas continues to doubt until he actually physically sees Jesus. So again, you think about, all right, we want people to see this group of apostles and follow their teaching. And yet what we see is, or what we find in the gospel accounts, is they are not necessarily people worth following or emulating because of their fear and their anxiety and what seems to be their lack of faith in this particular part of the story. But yet this detail makes sense historically. It's not something you would put in there if you were trying to compel people to follow the apostles in their teaching. But it does make sense if it is part of the story and it's a good natural fit to the story. And I think this, again, lends credibility to the reliability of the Gospels. Okay, embarrassing detail number 5 is one that has personally bothered myself over the years, and it's that Jesus claims that he doesn't know the day or the hour of his coming. So this is significant because Jesus, and traditionally Christians have believed, historically, the Orthodox view is that Jesus possesses all of the attributes of God. So he is part of the Godhead. He is the Son in his person, but he, in his essence, is divine. And because of that, he would have all of the divine attributes. And one of those would be omniscience. But in this particular account, and there are a couple other instances in the Gospels where Jesus seems to not know something, it really limits, at least in this particular instance, Jesus's divinity, or it seems to. It seems to make him maybe a little too human. And again, this is embarrassing if we're trying to make the case for Jesus being this divine Son of God, someone possessing the attributes of God. For him not to know certain things would be something that is embarrassing. It casts Jesus puts Jesus in a bad light. It makes the story not as compelling. It counts as a little bit of evidence against the case to be made for Jesus. So if the gospel authors, again, are trying to convince people to follow, this probably isn't the sort of detail they would include. But because they do include it, it lends credibility to their testimony and adds more evidence to this cumulative case we're making about embarrassing details in the Gospels. Okay, our sixth example of an embarrassing detail is regarding Jesus' resurrection, and specifically the witnesses to that resurrection. Now, in first century Palestine, and really a lot throughout ancient history, the testimony of women was considered not of equal value as the testimony of men. So, for instance, in courts of law, a woman's testimony was not considered valid. And so women often occupied a lower place in society, and men viewed themselves as superior in all sorts of ways, and one being intellectually to women. And so therefore they viewed their testimony as not being valid. Now, Jesus obviously has sort of turned the world upside down in regard to this and put men and women all on equal footing before the cross. But one interesting thing about the Gospels is that when we look at the resurrection accounts, the first people to witness the resurrection and the first people to go and tell others about what happened were women. They were the first people to the tomb. This in all four Gospels that they record this account, that the women are the ones who find the tomb empty. Now, again, think about it. You're promoting this story to first century Rome and Palestine and in this area where a woman's testimony is not considered valid. And you're going to write this story with women being the primary witnesses of the resurrection. Now, obviously the other apostles were witnesses of the resurrection as well, and they testified to that, but the women were the first ones to visit the tomb. Now, this doesn't add any weight to the story. In fact, it would be a reason that other people could scoff at Christianity. And it did. In fact, people did scoff at Christianity for the way that they elevated women. But this detail, if you were the gospel authors trying to invent a story, it's not the kind of detail that you would add in because it seems to detract from or take away from your story, and it's an embarrassment of sorts during that time. But they do include it, and the fact that they do include it seems to make the most sense if it actually did happen and wasn't something that is a fiction of some sort. Okay, our last example of an embarrassing detail is the death of Jesus. So again, as we said a few minutes ago, the gospel authors and the New Testament authors in the early church all believed that Jesus was the Son of God, that he possessed divine attributes, that his essence was divinity. He shared in that essence with the Father and the Spirit. And so you think first century, think Greco-Roman world, that if Jesus is God, then his death seems very odd. The fact that a God would come and would suffer and be able to die at the hands of mortal men seems very contrary to what you would expect God to be like if he came here. And really, Jesus' whole ministry is kind of a visual example of this, of his humility and his willing to stoop down and put himself at the mercy of men. But just his death in general, the fact that he died, really strikes against what public perception would be of what you would think God would be like if he was here. The fact that he would be shamed and stripped naked and spit upon and beat and hung on a cross and deserted and people mocking him, and that he would ultimately die, that sort of death doesn't seem to line up with what you would expect from God and in terms of him being here, right? And you could certainly envision him riding on a horse and conquering his enemies and doing some amazing miraculous feat. But Jesus is the culmination of his ministry is death, and particularly this kind of death on a cross. And so if you're a gospel author and you're wanting to invent a story about this Savior, this God-man that you want people to follow, including a death by crucifixion is not something that's going to engender a large following. It's not something that's on the surface or just from a popularity standpoint going to compel people. And the only reason you would include this sort of detail is if it happened. That makes the most sense. Now, any one of these embarrassing details by themselves doesn't necessarily make the case that the Gospels all the way through are reliable. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that throughout the Gospels, there is embarrassing detail after embarrassing detail after embarrassing detail sprinkled all throughout all 4 Gospels. And what best accounts for this is not that the Gospel authors were inventing the story, but that these embarrassing details actually happened and they're part of a larger narrative that is in fact reliable. This makes sense of those embarrassing details. And when you combine the embarrassing details with the other evidences that we've already looked at and the ones that we will continue to look at, it gives you this larger cumulative case that the Gospels are reliable. And each piece of evidence we add in previous videos, this one and the following videos, each evidence continues to build on this case. And imagine a rope, and each evidence is just an additional strand in that rope. And 1 or 2 is not enough to build a strong rope. But as we add 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 evidences, the rope begins to be stronger and stronger. And the case for the reliability of the Gospels gets stronger and stronger with each piece of evidence that we add.